go back. I'm your host, Bryan Abou Chacra, and on this week's episode, we will be reviewing Hearts and Minds in Special, the 13th and 14th episodes from Season 1 of Lost. Hearts and Minds focuses on Boone and Shannon, so what I really want to point out in this one is the relationship that we see between them, why they have such a hard time with each other and being around each other, which we find out in this episode is pretty hot. One of the first things I noticed is that Boone's girlfriend that he's with while playing tennis looks a lot like Shannon. And that I thought was really interesting because I actually mistook her for Shannon. The next thing I wanted to get to is the conversation that John has with Boone about Michelangelo's David, talking about how Michelangelo stared at a piece of marble for a long time, and that marble ended up being the statue of David, one of the world's largest and most amazing masterpieces. Interesting fact about that is that David and Goliath, the story that this comes from, David is supposed to be small, Goliath is the giant. This statue actually stands at around like 18 feet tall, making him a giant because he's a hero. Little fun fact for you guys to think about. I don't know if it ties really into this show, but I thought it was interesting. And I think that the lesson that John is trying to tell Boone in this scene is about the idea of patience and not just jumping in without having a clear plan of what to do. I think his explanation of Michelangelo coming into a studio and looking at this marble is an idea of taking your time and thinking and choosing what to do next rather than just jumping right in. And this again ties back into the main theme that we see a lot with Locke being about choice. Choice separates you from the stupider animals and from dying, basically. And I think that he's trying to really illustrate that point to Boone with this idea of Michelangelo, that great things come from patience and from things that seem like it's useless, but it takes thoughtful consideration. Boone, in his response here, is very eager to tell Shannon about what they found in the jungle, this hatch. He's having a hard time with lying to his sister. It gives him a lot of grief. So he's having a hard time dealing with this, and as a result, John knocks him out. He wants to teach him a lesson that he needs to let go of something, and they talk a little bit more about that as the show goes on, and I feel like that's a very big point tying back into what I was saying about what she's doing with Saeed and what his perception of her is. We find out that Shannon is actually in an abusive relationship and has called Boone out to Australia to save her. And in this flashback, we actually see our first encounter, direct encounter with another crash survivor. In this case, it's Sawyer. He is in the police headquarters with Boone and is being arrested for something we don't know yet. But that's the first time I think that we ever see a clear intersection between the two before they got on the plane. And I wanted to make sure that you guys paid attention to that too, if you didn't. So there are a few small points that I wanted to make sure to bring up to you guys in this episode. The first, of course, being a kind of larger point that Kate finds out Sun speaks English, but has been keeping it from her husband. The way that she discovers this, I think, is really cool because she's paying attention to Sun. After she makes a joke, it actually gets Sun to smile or laugh. And, I mean, that's what they say. If you're fluent in the language, you can make jokes. There is a great example. Sun actually has a very strong comprehension of English, and they have a conversation here. The next is that if people have been asking why is John able to have such wilderness experience, it's seen here in the conversation that he has with Saeed about being a Cub Scout and a Weebelo and learning a lot of how to be a survivor out in the wilderness. They teach you all of these wilderness techniques when you're a Cub Scout or a Boy Scout. I've never been one, so I don't know exactly, but that's sort of the stigma or the reputation that they have. Stigma is a bad word. We'll say reputation that a Boy Scout has. So it's cool to get an explanation, just a little subtle one, as to why Locke is able to actually track or be functioning in the wilderness when before we've seen him be a cripple. Little pieces of detail that are peppered in throughout the show. And I want to make sure that you guys are always paying attention to them. So one of the bigger points now, moving a little bit away from some of these smaller ones, is a subtlety that they use in this episode when Boone has been knocked out and he is worried about Shannon because he finds out that she's been tied up too. we hear the monster is going to come and get them. And as we find out from this episode, this is actually all a hallucination. That he sees this from the pace that Locke puts on his head after he's been tied up and tells him to find the proper motivation. But the way that you can tell, especially going back and having watched it again, is that the sound for the monster is not the same ticker sound that we've been hearing before. It sort of sounds the same, but it's actually very different than what we've seen before, and the way it's shot is slightly different too. This whole part is kind of shot in a very different way. The colors are either way too bright or they're muted, so you can see there's a distinct visual and auditory difference in this part, but really cool that they didn't use the same monster sound when they showed the monster in the hallucination, considering that Boone has had kind of minimal interactions with it, and the only thing he's really seen is the polar bear. So little pieces like that is one of the things that makes Lost such an amazing show. So pay attention to that. Like one of the things I always tell people to notice to give a good idea of what time it is cell phones. You see the different type of cell phone that he has at the beginning of the episode when he's playing tennis with that girl. It's kind of that 2004 Motorola phone that probably everybody had. Pay attention to the little details like that, like fashion and what the characters are holding. They'll always tell you something about the show that's really unique, which carries on. While we're having that conversation about being a Cub Scout in Weeblo, we have Locke giving the compass to Sayid. And through this, the compass actually shows Sayid something that he was testing with, trying to make his own, trying to get a bearing of where they are on the island, which is that there's a magnetic variance on the island. Where north should be, it's off by several degrees. Not a slight little 1 or 2 degree difference, but something that would only be caused by a magnetic anomaly. And for those of you who don't know, I mean, a compass is based off of magnetism. That's why it's north and south. So for it to be off that much, it would have to be something strong, and it would have to be something close by. So little bit of peppering here, trying to tell you maybe that's where there's something on the island like the French woman's signals coming from. Maybe it's being interfered by that, but that would have to be pretty close to them. So something is interesting about this magnetic anomaly that they're talking about. So Boone goes to Australia to go save his sister from an abusive relationship. He sees that she has been hit and her boyfriend is likely the cause, as is very, very clearly shown here, that this guy Bryan might be doing something bad to her. But really, what ends up happening is that Shannon is conning Boone out of money. That he's basically come there to pay off this guy, and that she's going to split the money with him. She's using Bryan, at the very least, using Boone to get money from her mother, or her stepmother. So this continues the theme of people being dishonest with each other and using each other. Kate using Jack, Sawyer being a con man, Kate also doing the same things to get what they want. And it definitely keeps in line with Shannon's character, because she's demonstrated using Charlie to show Boone that she can fish. Moving on from there, we see Locke sitting on the beach and Jack approaching him, asking him if he's seen any ships. This shot is very interesting because it definitely foreshadows something that goes on way, way later in the show that I'll point out once we get to it. But they're talking about not seeing a lot of each other and that they've been doing their own things. I think this is a very clear indication of the differing opinions they have on what they need to be doing on the island. The man of faith and the man of science. In this case, respectively, the man of faith is Locke. The man of science, as I've said a million times, is Jack. So this shot of them sitting together is sort of like the two sides coming together and seeing where they're both at, because they're two pieces of a larger whole. As the show goes on, we'll see how big that relationship actually ends up being. Another little point I wanted to bring to light here is the humor that Lost has, where we find Hurley trying to fish with Jin and ends up trying to get him to pee on him because he steps on a sea urchin, and asks if Jin can speak English because there's a rumor that around the island that he does, and he's just keeping it secret. Which, of course, if you guys haven't been paying attention, that's exactly what Sun is doing. So funny that they put that in there on the opposite side, and the way that Hurley tests it is to say that his wife is hot. Again, Lost has some great way of putting in humor into the show without it being overwhelming, but bringing some light to it and making these people feel real. Back at the beach, we have Charlie and Jack talking about John, and that Charlie puts his full faith in John because John saved him. And you have to think about this. So did Jack. Jack actually literally saved his life, brought him down from the tree that he was hanging in, and brought him back to life after he had been strung up trying to protect Claire. But he sees that John has saved his life because from previous experiences with Charlie, he's very faith-based. He goes to church. He sees a lot of images that are Christianity themed, and it's shown here in his faith with Locke being the only one who could save him on this island, and that he puts his absolute faith in him. And I think this is also them telling you very subtly that he's doing this with Boone as well, because he says that he needs to teach Boone a lesson in this episode about things that he needs to let go. So this spirituality also comes in, not just having to save ourselves every day in surviving, but saving ourselves spiritually, because that is important to a lot of people. A lot of Lost focuses on this kind of spiritual type of motifs, so I'll always point them out when I see them, and I really hope you guys send in your noticings of this type of theme as well, because really cool to talk about. And I don't know all faiths, so if you guys have an insight that I don't know, wegobackpodcast@gmail.com. We'll be happy to read it on the episode. We got some nice emails to read at the end of this episode today. So going back, we're talking about Shannon and Boone again. This is the revelation that Shannon believes Boone is in love with her, and it ends up being true. They get together in a very intimate way. They have sex. That's not even just suggested at. They totally just go for it. And this is something that at the time I didn't really pause for thought, but like they're putting a brother and a sister together here. And it's on national TV, on broadcast television, not on cable like Game of Thrones is on cable, so you can get away with a lot more. But this is on broadcast TV, and Lost really pushed the envelope with a lot of the things that they did that you hadn't seen before on national TV. So really, really interesting that they went with this racy subject. And for those of you who are worried they aren't related, their parents got married. So they aren't even half brother and sister. They are just step brother and sisters. No blood relations there. This isn't like a weird Lannister thing or anything incestuous outside of just there being step brothers and sisters. So moving on from there, we see this whole journey that Boone goes on where he effectively sees Shannon die. And we absolutely believe it, especially the first time we're watching this as it's airing. We thought that was it for Shannon. And I know that there were a lot of people who were actually pretty happy to see her go, because she is so annoying so far that it's just like absolutely unbearable to deal with her. She's just useless in everything that Boone says. So in this, we're really getting to feel almost the same sort of feelings that Boone is. He talks about when he goes through his whole journey and he meets up with Locke at the end, and he's believed that he's caused the death of his sister, that he feels relief for her actually being dead, which is kind of sick considering that, again, they've been brother and sister for so long, they've been so close, and then they've actually, been together in a more romantic way. But he's relieved to no longer have the responsibility of needing to care for his sister. And maybe that responsibility was imposed on him because he was the 10-year-old, and she was 8. So he had that older brother sort of mentality that he has to feel like he has to protect her, or maybe because he's just been infatuated with her his whole life. But what Locke is able to show him through this experience is that he is relieved to not have to be responsible for her, and that Boone needed to let go of this feeling of ownership or feeling of responsibility to Shannon, because it's hindering him from being able to do anything in his own life and experience his own life, because he's always running after her and trying to save her. So we go through this whole journey and we kind of see the change in Boone at the end of this episode. And that carries us directly into the next episode in Special, because we see the change that he has in that episode. But this episode, Special, actually focuses more on Walt and Michael and their relationship. Again, the relationship between two characters rather than just showing like one of the main characters like Jack, Locke, or any of the other like Sawyer. So in this episode, I wanted to point out a nice little bit of conversation that that Jack and Hurley are having at the caves about Walt listening to his dad and how Jack actually listened a little too well to his dad. And we can see that in moments of stress for Jack. Jack is always kind of beating himself up in the same way that we saw his father beat him up. And I will say that over and over on this show because it's definitely something you see a lot with Jack. The negative parts of Jack are impositions that he places on himself based on what his father had told him about his personality. Instead of being his own man and making his own choices, we see Jack sort of getting wrapped up in his own decisions based only on what he thinks his father would say. So I think that that's a really interesting point that they subtly slide in there for you about Jack's personality. But in this conversation, we also get another really interesting remark from Hurley, which is that Michael looks like he hates being a father. And I think that couldn't be more true about Michael, or at least our perception of Michael in this point. But we are totally proven that wrong in this episode. We see that all Michael wanted to do was be a father for Walt, but he wasn't able to. And so he's struggling now because he has gotten this boy for the first time, finally gotten his son back in his life since he was a little baby. And it's a hard time for him to connect with his son, which is especially interesting because we find out that Walt is actually named after Michael's father. So this might be a sort of like nudge and a hint at maybe Michael having an issue with his father and wanting the same sort of approval from his son, or trying to honor his father in his own way. Again, tying back into maybe what Jack said about listening too well to his father. So really, really interesting point. Now, one of the funny things about Lost is that they had a lot of great fan sites that were around at the time. And one of the best ones that I think started around here was this website called Walt.com. Walt had three A's, and it was a count of how many times Michael said Walt in an episode of Lost. And it was hilarious. You go to the site and it was like a YTMD or whatever it's called website of just a picture of Michael's face yelling Walt over and over and over and over. And it was so funny to see this happen at the time because the community was so into this show. They were already picking it apart with a fine-tooth comb. So I just want to make sure you guys are aware of some of the fun stuff that maybe you didn't get to see, especially because I think a lot of it isn't there anymore. I think you can go to like waybackmachine.com, one of those archive sites, and maybe still see it. But it's definitely something I want to point out to you when I remember about it. So we find out Walt's taken away from him. His mother's moving to Amsterdam with Walt. There's basically no choice that Michael has. He doesn't have a job. She's taking him with him because she's gotten a great job, and that's it. And there's nothing that Michael can do. He's stuck. The courts won't be against him. He has nothing. They're not married. He has no ammunition to try to keep his son, but it's sort of like he has to let go of it even though he doesn't want to. So Michael, now with the opportunity to finally raise his son, doesn't want his son to be raised on this island. He comes up with the idea to build a raft and goes to Walt to go get his help building this raft. He's going to get his son off this island. But we find Walt's reading a comic book, and that really pisses off Michael because, again, his son is not listening to him. But I think a lot of it really comes from the fact that Michael is not listening to his son. He just kind of does for a little bit, like, oh, you like looking at pictures, and he tries to connect with his son, but then only goes a half measure and gets upset that his son doesn't immediately connect with him as well, and throws away his comic book, and that's not any way to get your kid to do anything you want them to. So it's very interesting to see how they keep struggling in their relationship at the beginning of the series. One of the things I think that makes their relationship so troubled is how Michael feels threatened by other people being father figures to Walt, since he's never really had a significant input in his son's life. He's threatened by Susan's husband, Bryan, who actually this is now the second character in 2 episodes that are named Bryan. Shannon's boyfriend in the first one, and now Susan's husband. So the other guy's always named Bryan. I don't know. Maybe it's something to do with me. It's just my name. Anyway, but yeah, he feels threatened by other father figures in Walt's life. And that's why I think he also has an issue with Locke, or that is the reason why I think he has an issue with Locke about the time that Walt is spending with him, because he wants that type of attention from his son, but he's not getting it. And Locke tries to sort of continue on the theme of helping people learn and grow, and tells him, you need to listen more to your son. Watch what he does. He has potential. He's special. He's different. And that really affects Michael. He doesn't like being told things about his son that he doesn't know, because he should know them. He feels this sort of guilt, I think, that he doesn't know these very personal and intimate things about his son because he's never been given the opportunity to. And now with this opportunity, it seems like he's squandering it, but I think it's because he's guided by his own selfishness and what he wants out of the relationship with his son. This causes Michael and Walt to ultimately be at odds, and Walt runs away with the dog. The dog runs away from Walt, and then that puts Walt in a life and death situation with the polar bear, which ties back to the comic book that he had been reading earlier, where he saw a polar bear in it. And I think this is significant because, as we find out in a flashback, Walt, while looking at a book of Australian birds, has a bird fly into the glass when he's trying to get the attention of his mother and Bryan. So maybe this is an instance of how Walt might be special or different. I mean, this has got to clearly be what they're telling us here, what the writers are telling us. Because if you look at it, it's the way that he finds attention from his parents. He wants his father to pay attention to him, and his father really isn't. Like I said, he's not listening. He's there, he's kind of commanding him, but he's not really he's not talking to him. He's just telling him what to do. So really driving a rift between him and his son, especially because, we find out that the reason Walt and Michael are together is because Susan died. Walt's mother has died. Bryan has asked Michael to come take his son back, take Walt to New York with him, and he's paid for everything. And Walt, upon first seeing his father, doesn't even recognize who he is, has no idea, asks him, who are you? And what we find out on all this time that Walt has been with his mother, Michael had been sending his son letters that his son had never received. So for whatever reason Susan had, she didn't want Michael in Walt's life at all. And I wonder what that is. I don't know if it comes back later. I honestly, at this point, I can't remember. So I'll bring it up when it comes up. But I can't remember why she didn't want her son to be around Michael. Maybe she just didn't see a future with him, and that while she loved Michael, he wasn't doing anything at the time. He was unemployed, and he had given up on his art, and he was trying to find construction work and wasn't able to do that. And maybe she was tired of it, and he was motivated. I mean, they talk at the beginning of the episode while they're looking at cribs about how Michael expects her to support him and Walt. And she doesn't seem too thrilled about that. She looks like she is somebody who wants a producer, somebody who's going to be a provider and able to take care of her and her son. And at this point in their lives, Michael can't do that. So very interesting to see how Walt can influence the world around him so far, because we've seen him actually have very clear coincidences. And in shows, especially ones like Lost, coincidences aren't coincidences. What do they say in The Dark Knight? You're not allowed to believe in coincidences. That's kind of how you have to look at the show. It's probably not a coincidence if you see it reoccurring. So always pay attention to stuff like that. But yeah, we find out that Michael's letters had been withheld, and that's actually where Walt and Michael start to really bond after their whole ordeal. After Michael having to submit to having the help of Locke to save his son, they sit down and they reminisce over the letter that we saw him drawing after Michael had gotten into a car accident trying to go get his boy, as if everything in the world was trying to stop his son from knowing who his father was. He got hit by a car when he was going to try to go to Amsterdam. He wasn't able to send these letters, and finally he's able to connect with his son on a very personal level, and Walt's able to see that his father's actually cared about him for all these years, not just been aloof and not part of his life, because clearly Walt holds some animosity towards his father for not trying to be a part of his life, or what he thought was not trying to be a part of his life. So that takes us to the end of this episode, where Charlie is reading Claire's diary and pulls up something about a black rock. We still don't know what this black rock is, but we've now heard it mentioned by Rousseau and by Claire, which I find very, very interesting that these two characters are the ones that are introducing us to this concept of the black rock. And whatever that may be, wherever that is, or whatever that is, it's interesting that these are the two characters that notice it. So that I'll come back to later on in the episode when we, or not in this episode, but later on in the show, further on down the line when it becomes more important. But with that, we see that Locke and Boone actually find Vincent in the jungle, or while trying to find Vincent, find Claire, and she does not look good. And that takes us to the final end of this episode, where we're not really sure what's going to happen. Where has Claire been? Has she been out in the jungle? Is she surviving by herself? What happened to her baby? What happened to her pregnancy? Like I said, is she okay? All right, so I'm going to jump right into emails right now, guys. Thank you every week. I can't say thank you enough for all the feedback you guys give me and all of the input that you have. It's really wonderful. Same people are emailing me. I'd like to see a lot more. A couple things that I wanted to ask you guys to do is if you're going to have a question, keep it on the shows that we're talking about and don't go too far ahead. I'll try to respond to some of the stuff, like I said, in email back to you guys, but make it part of something else so that it's a little bit easier for me to read as a whole. Because right now I kind of have to jump around and it loses some of your question in it, and I want to make sure I maintain the integrity of your question because I really appreciate it. So this is going to go right into Ryan's email. He's talking about Hearts and Minds and Special as well. The first thing that he wanted to ask me, or what his question for me is what is the paste that Locke was making for Boone? Was it really what made him hallucinate about Shannon's death, or was it the monster in the same way that Locke had his face-to-face with it? Because Locke does say something about, is that what it made you see? I think it's just the paste. It's some sort of hallucinogen that Locke, for some reason, knows how to make, and he implements it on Boone. And it allows Boone to kind of like go through a spiritual journey to be able to see what he needs to do next. And I think that that's a big theme for Locke when he's talking about the story of Michelangelo sitting there at the hatch and explaining it. He's talking about watching and being patient and being spiritual and understanding what you need to do next before you do it, rather than just aimless going forward without any sort of plan and running into issues. So I think that's really all that it is for that. And I appreciate your email and your question. He also did notice that I had not noticed before, but it is true. Carlton Cuse, one of the main two voices for the show of Lost, which was Damon Lindelof, and after this episode, Carlton Cuse. This is his first credit in the show. This is where he came on and really started to be more involved in the show, and I think for the better, because we get a lot of great stuff from him. So Ryan, thank you for your observations. Really appreciate that. Next up, I'm going to go to Walter. He says, so in episode 13, Jack says, if there's one person who I'd put my faith in to save us all, it would be John Locke. Hearing that right after Boone was knocked out by John and tied up is a bit strange. How I see it is that Charlie thinks John is made for this island, and John probably thinks that as well. But then you have John forcing Boone to have this experience, in quotes. At that point, it is really what the island is that really what the island is telling Boone, or is that what John wants to tell Boone? Almost as if John thinks he is a vessel from which the island communicates with the group. That might be true. I think he has an understanding with the island, going back to his man of faith mentality, that he's able to communicate clearly because he's been given a gift. You have to remember that up until this point, before he was on this island, John Locke was in a wheelchair, and now he's walking and hunting and being out and able to maneuver within this island. So I think that whether or not John thinks he is the vessel for the island, I think that maybe that's what the storytelling is trying to communicate with us, is that he sort of is the voice of the island. He's able to communicate these opportunities, you just have to listen. And he's trying to help Boone go through this because there's no other way, I think, for Boone to see it. I think Boone needs to go through it the same way that the way that he went through, in the same way that Charlie had to go through it in a completely separate way that he went through. You remember that Locke interjected and offered help without being asked for it with Charlie, and came up with a plan to help him see what he needed to do, but didn't guide him himself. Maybe Boone needed a little bit more of a push in that direction and needed to have some sort of spiritual experience, because we've seen so far, and at this point it's starting to tip more towards Locke, that Boone is sort of like Jack and sort of like Locke, where he's trying to help, he's very factual, and he goes by what he knows, but then he also has some faith, and he's following Locke for a reason. So I think that that's really a big point, that they're communicating that he might at least be a voice for the island since it can't speak for itself. Moving on to our last email, Omar writes in, I think Boone realized that Shannon just uses him, and the fact that he claimed he was relieved when he thought she was dead must mean that he is tired of being manipulated by her. I find it a little ironic that when Boone realizes Shannon is controlling him and exploiting his feelings to get him to do what she wants, he fails to realize that Locke is manipulating him based on his feelings for Shannon, using hate instead of love in order to control Boone. The title of this episode, Hearts and Minds, is quite literally demonstrated. Boone's love for Shannon represents the heart, and the mind is represented by not only Shannon manipulating Boone, but also in Locke playing mind games with Boone in order to alienate him from Shannon. I think that's a very interesting point. I don't know that he was necessarily trying to alienate Boone from Shannon. I think he was trying to kick him of his responsibility towards her, because he believes, I believe John has this belief that everybody can be their own man. They just need to follow their own path. And we see that he's doing that. We see John maneuvering in and out of the island a whole bunch without needing a compass anymore, that he now has faith in the island to guide him to where he needs to go. I mean, it's brought him to this hatch. It's brought him to Boar. It's brought him to being able to walk again. So he believes that if he's able to express that to people, whether it's through showing them like he did with Charlie or by making them go through an experience with Boone, that they'll be able to benefit from the island as well. I don't think that Locke is necessarily manipulating Boone. I think he's just asking him to question his own beliefs and see if he actually believes what he's saying, or if he's just saying those beliefs because he has to, like he feels responsible for his sister, but he isn't really responsible for his sister. She is her own person and able to make her own choices. And that is a very, again, big point in Lost, is making your own choices. Well, everyone, I would like to thank you again for sitting through this episode of We Go Back with me. Next week on We Go Back, we will be covering Homecoming and Outlaws, so I'm really looking forward to reading your emails, seeing what you guys have to say. Always email me, wegobackpodcast@gmail.com, with any theories, questions, thoughts, or anything that you guys want to discuss. You can also follow me at King Lord Bryan on Twitter, and go on youtube.com/DuBryan. I have a playlist put up there for any episodes 2 weeks older or back, and anything you guys want to talk. Like I said, I'm open. I love to hear what you guys think. I love all the emails that I'm getting so far. I love all the responses. And thanks to everybody at PAX East who came out and talked to me a little bit about Lost. I appreciate the support. I love that you guys are coming along with me. I've been getting nothing but positive responses and a lot of support from you guys. And it makes me keep wanting to do this, because this has really been a lot of fun. So I want to thank you guys again. I look forward to speaking with you guys next week. And until then, see you later.